Where do you think the number lands? I know I'm asking you to take a best guess sort of approach here, but are we talking 2 to 4 trillion? Are we talking less than 2 trillion? What's your best guess here?
Well, look, we invest about, this is the way to think about it, I think. We invest about 300 billion, let's say $300 billion a year in infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But only about 30 to 40% of that is invested in new projects because our stuff is so old. 70% of that goes to old stuff, to operations and maintenance, just dealing with old stuff. So that's a big issue. So there's a triage issue in terms of what you invest in. The other big issue is that in 1956, well, actually as early as recently as 1980, about 70% of infrastructure spend came from the federal government, and that's about 30% and 70% from the states and municipalities. So the almost the dirty little secret is people don't talk about the fact that we've silently shifted an enormous amount of the burden for infrastructure investment onto states and municipalities. Third issue that I think is extraordinary is when you talk about a lot of the infrastructure that's in the Biden plan, and I communicate that to them as well, is a lot of this is actually private investment. I mean, electric charging stations, wind projects, even transmission projects. So, answer to your question, I think this thing lands at somewhere around, $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. That's over 10 years for new infrastructure, not for operations and maintenance of old stuff. But I also think it gets plussed up pretty dramatically by increasing the room for pension fund investment in infrastructure projects. And there, I think you start to move to the $2.5 trillion figure. But we're, again, with my book, right? But the book starts, it's Thanksgiving 2030, and believe it or not, we got it right in 2021. And that's the whole point, right? Can we get this thing right? And can we, if you think about pension fund investment in our infrastructure assets, again, renewable energy, electric charging stations, we're designing a highway project that has, it's $1 billion project that has about $200 million worth of revenue sources, new infrastructure project. You start to think about that and you realize that there's a giant role for pension funds. But if a pension fund invests in a project, that means I invested if I'm a pension fund owner. So there's a huge opportunity for us to be imaginative and creative and responsible, because the other issue, and I think this is increasingly on the shoulders of the Congress as they think about this bill, we've got $30 trillion in debt, which, by the way, we're passing on to the next 2 generations. That's not okay. So we've got to make very significant investments, but we've got to figure out how to smartly bring in long-term patient money to assist with those investments. This is a huge opportunity for this country right now.
Dan, did you want to jump in there? It looks like you had a question. Or
I'm just wondering if we think about what's the government entity who's going to be the recipient of this funding. What is some of the guidance you can give to them as far as they're used to managing? Like you said, 70% is on the operations and maintenance side, 30% on new, and that could flip. And all of a sudden you have a bunch of money. How are you going to manage that money well? How are you going to spend it well? How are you going to have visibility and accountability to your constituents? Just what advice would you give to the government agencies on the call that are going to get this money?
Another softball question. That's easy, straightforward. Look, I think what's most interesting about a question like that, the position we're in right now, is that increasingly the conversation needs to turn to benefits, what the projects are producing for people, and really, I know this is messy, but engaging citizens in this conversation. And citizens not as not as sort of from a NIMBY perspective, but from the user perspective, right? Really engaging people. You know, one of the things I show my new employees every time we bring somebody to CGLA is I show the Steve Jobs YouTube video from 1997 when he just came back to Apple, and it was right before he was Saint Steve Jobs. And he was a failed business guy, right? He was a doubly failed business guy. And he's sitting on the table, and a guy gets up in the back and he says, Mr. Jobs, you know, you have just canceled this piece of software. You obviously don't know what you're doing. You know, why don't you tell us why you do that? Because you clearly don't understand your business. This guy literally said that to Steve Jobs. Can you imagine that? And by the way, could you tell us what you've been doing over these last couple of years? And you can see Steve Jobs, you know, he takes a gulp of water and he's about to speak, and he takes another gulp of water. Then he sits down and he goes, you know, we've got to figure out what the consumer wants. We've got to figure out what the client wants, and we've got to build things that way so we really delight consumers. And increasingly, Dan, I think that's the answer to your question, that, you know, we've had a kind of a mentality that infrastructure is so complicated, and it really focuses on getting this right from a technical point of view, and you forget that it's a product and it's a service, and every product and every service has as big an emotional component as it has a technical component. And the real point at the end of the day is to provide some sort of emotional satisfaction to your clients. And that's one of the things that I think is really interesting and potentially transformative in terms of how we think about infrastructure. And it gets, you know, either better or worse as you think about having how many sensors, how much data, upgrading your services in terms of a transit facility, in terms of its software, in terms of its rolling stock, in terms of the experience, in terms of ticketing machines every 6 months or every year. So everybody has a different experience all the time. The sort of mobility as a service piece of this increases dramatically. Think about what happens if we have water meters where you can actually tell the quality of the water when you turn on the tap. How dramatically would that change the way a water authority operated? That would also, if you did it right, ruin the bottled water industry, but that's a whole other issue.
I don't know about that. Living in Arizona, I'm not sure I want to know what the water quality is, but please continue.
No, but the point is absolutely right? Because one of the things that's happened, and one of the things that's taken so much pressure off of our need to provide investment to the public infrastructure owners is the privatization of infrastructure services. Like I buy bottled water, right? All of this stuff, if you think about that, is we need water. So let's have the same quality of water for everybody. Broadband, let's make sure that everybody has that as well. We've got to figure out how to make sure that the global commons, that the US commons, that we're all treated the same, that we all have the same shot at accessing public infrastructure to accomplish what we want to accomplish in life, whether that's work, whether that's starting a business, whether that's having a decent amount of leisure time. And a lot of this stuff really depends on our creativity. It can't be stopped by the budget, because great projects attract a budget. Great projects solve problems that bring money to them. I mean, I'm thinking as I talk to you guys about the largest leisure company in the US. Do you guys know what that is? It's the Army Corps of Engineers. They have 600 reservoirs that we can use for leisure, you know, hunting, fishing, boating, swimming. But all these reservoirs are 50 to 55 years old. They're dual purpose. A lot of them provide electricity or fresh water for communities, and they sell that water. Huge opportunities to reimagine how we invest and own and operate our assets.
So you've been speaking on this a little bit, or not a little bit, a lot of it, but I want to ask the question very specifically. How do you anticipate the funding will split? Which areas of our nation's infrastructure will receive the most? I know you mentioned, I think you mentioned intercity rail, broadband infrastructure. How is this going to be divided up?
I think, in these kinds of exchanges, I'm supposed to be the voice of God to Moses. And that's a really interesting question, because just take transportation. If transportation is split the way it's been split traditionally, freight rail is private, highways get 80 to 90% of the budget, and transit gets 10 to 20% of the budget. That has to change pretty dramatically. We're doing a thought leadership report on transit right now, and what transit looks like when it comes out of the recession. And what you're seeing inevitably is that transit, there's not enough public money available to make our transit system healthy. So transit systems are going to have to come up with alternative sources of funding, whether it's land, air, value capture, or other different kinds of opportunities like performance contracts with the private sector. Look, what I would say is, to answer your question more specifically, is if you've looked at the Biden plan from when it started, which was a very traditional plan, straightforward answering your question, now it's in flux, and it looks like it's moving much more towards something that would allow us to at least compete with China on the digitization, electrification, advanced manufacturing, bring the supply chain home front. That means you invest more in logistics. That means you invest more in multimodal facilities. That means you invest more in intelligent highways. That's one of the things that we see happening increasingly. And we see the plan continuing to evolve as Congress gets involved more towards this kind of job creation for the future, rather than the way money's been distributed in the past. So hopefully that's a decent answer to your question, but I think smart new infrastructure is going to get a relatively larger proportion of budget than other infrastructure. And one more point, just to make it very clear, and I think it's relevant to the audience, is if you think about infrastructure as the brains of the economy, that means artificial intelligence, it means big data, it means machine learning, but it really means empowerment of the individual, right? It means that we're going to figure out how to use all of that so people get what they want, can start businesses anywhere they want, whenever it makes sense to them. That's not how China thinks about this. China thinks about it from the top down. We think about it from the bottom up. We're in the same race as China, right? So unless we figure out how to compete better and invest more in AI, ML, big data, IoT related infrastructure assets, we're going to have problems. So that's where that's inevitably going to go. Last point along these lines, I think I already made a last point, but the last point is, if we have $30 trillion in debt, that's a big deal. We have $30 trillion in pension fund assets. We're a pension fund superpower. There's no reason, if the Canadians can invest directly from their pension funds into infrastructure assets, why we can't do that too. And that doesn't mean it weakens the public sector. Going back to Dan's original question, that actually strengthens the public sector. The public sector becomes the manager, the performance architect, the transparency provider, and the people who hold investors' feet to the fire to make sure the assets actually perform the way they were promised to perform. And if you're going to technologize, digitize, electrify assets, that means over the next 20 or 30 years, their performance metrics are going to increase pretty radically going forward.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the way you ended that topic is one of our questions from the audience, which has to do with the focus. What we're hearing in the media is about spend. How much money can we spend, but not a lot of time on how are we going to measure the return on that investment. So this is one of the gripes I know I have working in the private sector is we constantly have to demonstrate that we're good stewards of capital, and that we can demonstrate a better return on capital than you could putting it into a bond fund or putting it somewhere else. So do you see anything that we can do as citizens to help flip that script and start to drive ROI conversations? So we're going to spend $2.5 trillion. How do we make sure that we make more than $2.5 trillion on that investment?
So what's really interesting about the conversation to me is that that's a really smart comment. And what I find is that people all over the country are worried sick about that exact question. And it's not just infrastructure professionals, it's everybody. I was talking to a county commissioner in Ohio a couple weeks ago, and he said, yeah, I'm getting more money this year than my entire budget was for last year. And hell, I'll take it and I'll figure out how to spend it, but I'm not happy about this. And I think I think there's two pieces here, and hopefully I'm answering your question, Dan. I think one piece is Washington has to do a much better job of listening to citizens, because citizens are really smart. Sort of the wisdom of the crowd makes a huge amount of sense. The other point is technology allows us to do a much better job of not just polling people, but monitoring performance and making the kinds of iterative changes to increase the performance, which, by the way, is a nice feedback loop back into citizens. That's what we're not doing. You know, everybody has one of these, and one of these is, you know, every living American has, except for my granddaughter who's like 4 weeks old, has a supercomputer in their hand. And the power of that's amazing, but the infrastructure community has not figured out how to use that yet, or even come close, right? And people are really good at making decisions about how, they're much better than Congress about making decisions about how public money should be spent, right? There's no way we should have $30 trillion in debt and be having a sort of an unhinged conversation about spend rather than investment.
Yeah, no, and I'll give it back to Evan, but you reminded me with that comment you made from the commissioner was a interaction I had with the chief engineer of a large tollway authority a couple of years ago, when they talked about, for year after year, it was about $200 million they had to invest in infrastructure. And all of a sudden, in this instance, it was a state budget, not a federal budget, was passed, and it went to $1.4 billion almost overnight. And so one of the comments was to make sure they have the systems in place to manage a 7x increase in their spending. The approval processes were going to be different. It's a lot of money. The public is going to want to make sure you're spending that money well. So they understood that they needed people, they needed the process, and they needed the technology to deal with that. And that's one of the things that we're talking with our customers, is trying to prepare them for this influx of, great, you're going to go start all these projects. Do you have enough project managers on staff to even manage? In fact, I was surprised in our public sector clients that they have as much problems. In fact, I'd argue more problems spending the money they have. It's not about going over budget. It's not spending the budget you were given. So you raise taxes, you've raised this money, and then you find out you only spend half of it. And then the citizens get upset because why are you raising taxes if you're not spending the money we're already giving you? So anyways, not a question, just a reflection.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.